You're not supposed to know this. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to survive. The records were destroyed, the ledgers burned, and the men who whispered these stories into their cups at night did so with trembling hands. But there are always cracks, and if you lean close enough to those cracks, you can hear what the world was ordered to forget. Greystone Asylum, 1867. A cathedral of suffering, built in grey stone to disguise its purpose: control. The wards were endless hallways of locked doors, the air thick with disinfectant and hopelessness. But deep in the east wing, behind a door that did not exist on any map, was a boy who did not belong to this world. He was never admitted. He was never discharged. His name was not written anywhere because, according to the state of New Jersey, he never existed. Yet men quit their jobs rather than walk past his door. Nurses wept in silence and signed transfer papers they could not explain. And one man, an orderly whose name you won't find anywhere, collapsed dead outside that room with no wound, no sign of struggle, and a look on his face that terrified the coroner into silence. This isn't a ghost story. This is a blueprint. A glimpse into how far the hands behind the curtain will go to control reality itself. That boy's existence was erased because he was not a patient. He was a mirror. He reflected more than he should have, revealed too much, and those in power understood what would happen if he was ever spoken of in full. If you stay with me, I'll take you down that locked hallway step by step. You'll smell the damp plaster. You'll hear the keys turning in the locks. And when you finally see him, when you see what he was, something inside you will shift. You'll start to notice things you weren't supposed to notice. This story is dangerous, but you're already here, and there's no turning back. They called it Ward E, but even that was a lie. It wasn't a ward. It wasn't even a real part of the asylum. Most of the staff never knew it existed, and those who did learned quickly to keep their mouths shut. Ward E was built for one purpose: containment. Not of disease, not of madness, but of knowledge. That hallway was a wound in the building, stitched shut with secrecy. The door that led to it was locked with 3 iron bolts, and the key wasn't kept on a ring like the others. It was hidden in a safe, inside an office that only the director could enter. If you ever walked past that corridor, you'd feel it before you saw it. The temperature dropped. The smell changed. Even the air seemed to resist your breathing, and if you stayed too long, a sound would rise from the other side of that heavy wooden door, a faint tapping, almost like fingers brushing against glass. No one was supposed to investigate that sound. The rule was simple: unlock the door, deliver the tray of food, take nothing, speak nothing, leave quickly. No one stayed long enough to see if the boy actually ate. The boy, that's all anyone called him. There was no name on his record because there was no record. He wasn't listed among the patients. He wasn't listed among the staff. And yet he was there, day after day, year after year, growing but not aging, watching but never speaking. Some said his eyes were wrong, not deformed, not grotesque, just wrong. Like looking at him was looking at a reflection that wasn't quite yours. An orderly named Patrick Hughes lasted 3 months before quitting. He told his wife he couldn't sleep because every time he closed his eyes, he saw himself. But older, dying, rotting. His wife left him soon after, and 2 weeks later, Patrick disappeared. Ward E was more than a prison. It was a warning. The boy didn't try to escape, and no one dared to set him free. There was a fear in that place that didn't come from him. It came from above, from the men who kept him there. They weren't afraid of what he might do. They were afraid of what he might reveal. The asylum was a cage, but Ward E was a mirror, and that mirror was cracking. His birth was never supposed to happen. The records, what little exist, claim he was born during a snowstorm in 1843 in a crumbling house on the outskirts of Krakow. The midwife who delivered him, an old woman named Aniela, swore that the child came into the world without a cry. No gasp for breath, no squirming limbs, no heartbeat she could find. He was silent, heavy and cold, as though he had been pulled from a river instead of a womb. Aniela declared him stillborn and wrapped him in a sheet. But when she laid him down, his eyes opened. Those eyes, pale as glass, stared at her without blinking, and though the child's lips never moved, She heard a voice. Not a baby's wail, not even a whisper, but a sound that spoke directly inside her skull. "Don't tell them." Aniela fainted. When she awoke, the child's mother was gone, her bed empty and soaked with blood. No one ever saw her again. The father, a poor shoemaker named Marek, carried the boy into town the next morning, begging for someone to take him. He claimed his son hadn't cried, hadn't eaten, hadn't moved, only watched. By evening, Marek had vanished too, leaving the boy swaddled on the steps of the local church. The priest who found him sent him to an orphanage where he became known only as the boy. But children whispered other names. They said he could speak to them without sound, that he knew when they would fall ill, when they would be punished, even when they would die. At night, they swore he'd stand beside their beds, just watching, until they fell asleep. By the time he was 5, 3 children from that orphanage were dead. No cause, no marks, just gone. The authorities took him away after that, shuttling him between hospitals and churches, each one refusing to keep him for long. He never cried, he never laughed, he never spoke, at least not out loud. The final stop was the asylum. They sealed him in Ward E, locked the door, and buried the paperwork. Whatever he was, they didn't want the world to see it. Ward E was not a place for children. It was where Krakow hid its failures, men who had torn their own faces open, women who had clawed out their eyes, and soldiers who screamed at invisible enemies were all dumped behind those thick iron doors. And yet, in a small locked cell, they placed the boy. No one remembered bringing him meals, but he never starved. No one saw him sleep, but he never tired. Nurses whispered that he could sit for days, cross-legged on the cold stone floor, watching a crack in the wall as though it were alive. Then the screaming began. One by one, patients in Ward E started shrieking through the night. They tore at their restraints, begged to be moved, sobbed that the child was in their rooms. Guards checked every cell. The boy was always where he had been, silent and motionless. But the patients insisted he was walking among them, without footsteps, without breathing. 2 orderlies quit after waking to find him standing beside their beds, his pale eyes wide open. They swore they felt him inside their heads, whispering things they could never repeat. Within a month, Ward E was nearly empty. Some patients hung themselves. Others scratched prayers into the walls with their fingernails. Those who survived were too terrified to speak. The doctors moved the boy to a padded room and locked him inside with chains. Still, strange things happened. The bells in the chapel rang in the middle of the night, though no one had touched them. Crucifixes turned upside down. A nun reportedly saw him sitting on the ceiling, head tilted, watching her. They tried to baptize him again, thinking he was cursed. The priest poured water over his head, whispering Latin prayers, but halfway through the boy reached out and touched the man's chest. The priest collapsed, dead before he hit the floor. After that, no one touched him. They sealed Ward E permanently, losing it off from the rest of the asylum. The boy stayed locked in that single room, growing older, quieter, and stranger. He was a secret the city buried, and for decades they pretended he didn't exist. But secrets rot, and they leak. For 30 years, Ward E was silent. The asylum continued its grim work. Electroshock treatments, ice baths, and experimental surgeries that left patients hollow-eyed. But no one mentioned the sealed wing. New nurses didn't even know it existed. The old staff, those who had survived that winter, would cross themselves when walking past the iron door, their faces pale. Then came the smell. It started as a faint odor in the west hallway, like burnt hair mixed with damp earth. Janitors scrubbed the floors and disinfected the walls, but the smell grew stronger every day, spreading through the asylum like a sickness. Some swore they heard scratching, like nails dragging along stone. One night, a nurse on rounds reported hearing a child singing. The melody was slow, strange, and in a language no one recognized. When she followed the sound, it led her straight to the locked doors of Ward E. The singing stopped the moment she touched the handle. The head doctor, a man named Dr. Filipovich, ordered the door opened. The lock was rusted, It took 3 men to break the chains, and when they finally pried it open, a wave of cold air spilled out, so icy it frosted the lantern glass. The smell was overpowering now, thick and sweet like decay. Inside, the padded cell looked untouched. Dust coated the floor in a perfect layer, but the boy was gone. In his place was something no one could explain. Every inch of the walls was covered in drawings. Thousands of tiny, intricate sketches burned into the padding as if drawn with a hot needle. They showed cities collapsing into fire, forests of bone, seas filled with floating corpses. In the center of one wall was a perfect image of the asylum itself, drawn as if seen from above. And standing in the doorway was the boy. He hadn't aged a day. His eyes were wide, shining with something ancient and unnatural. He tilted his head and whispered, "You shouldn't have opened it." Then the lanterns went out. Darkness swallowed the hallway. Nurses screamed, lanterns shattered, and something slithered through the air like static electricity. The asylum's generator roared, flickered, and died. For the first time in decades, Blackwood Asylum went completely dark. Dr. Filipovich barked orders, his voice trembling as he struck a match. The flame illuminated the boy's face, those ancient, unblinking eyes reflecting the fire like polished glass. He hadn't moved. Then the walls began to hum. It started low, a vibration so deep it rattled their teeth. The drawings etched into the padded cell glimmered faintly, as if lit from behind, glowing lines weaving together into something alive. A nurse dropped her lantern, and when it struck the ground, the flame didn't die. It crawled upward, twisting into shapes like clawed hands, reaching out from the shadows. The boy stepped forward. His bare feet left no prints on the dusty floor. He whispered again, this time louder, "You've let it out." Suddenly, a deafening crack split the air. One of the padded walls buckled, the drawings peeling themselves off the fabric like living ink. They floated upward, swirling around the room in a storm of symbols and sigils. The air turned frigid, their breath fogging as if the asylum had been plunged into an Arctic wasteland. Nurses fled, shrieking, as the storm of burning symbols burst into the hallway. The symbols clung to anyone they touched, searing into their skin like brands. Dr. Filipovich grabbed the boy by the shoulders, shaking him. "What are you?" he demanded, voice breaking. The boy smiled for the first time. It wasn't a child's smile. It was ancient, mocking, and impossibly calm. "I'm what they prayed would never wake up." And with that, the asylum erupted in chaos. Doors to long-sealed patient cells swung open by themselves. Screams echoed through the halls. Something heavy crawled there, rough the ventilation ducts, rattling metal like bones in a coffin. The boy walked forward, untouched by the madness, humming that same haunting melody. Every light in the asylum flickered back on for just a moment, revealing a single horrifying truth. The drawings now covered every wall in the building. The asylum descended into a nightmare. The humming from the walls had grown into a deafening chorus, 1,000 voices whispering in languages older than time. Nurses stumbled blindly through the corridors, clutching their ears, blood trickling from their noses as the sound dug into their skulls. One orderly fell to his knees, screaming until his voice broke, clawing at his own face as if trying to rip something out of his head. The boy moved calmly, each step deliberate. Wherever he walked, the walls bent slightly inward, as if the building itself was bowing to him. The once sterile halls of Blackwood now resembled a cathedral built for some ancient, malevolent god. Dr. Filipovich struggled to keep up, gasping for breath as he followed the boy through the chaos. He passed a nurse who was frozen mid-step, eyes rolled back, her body rigid like a doll. Her shadow on the wall moved independently, clawing and twisting as though alive. From the upper levels came the sound of chains snapping. One by one, the asylum's most dangerous inmates were freed. Not by human hands, but by unseen forces. Doors groaned open, restraints fell away, and the corridors filled with shuffling figures. But these weren't simply escaped patients. Their bodies moved unnaturally like puppets pulled by invisible strings. They chanted softly, their words in unison with the whispers bleeding from the walls. Dr. Filipovich ducked into a side corridor, heart pounding. He spotted a fellow doctor, Dr. Kessler, sprinting toward him. Her face was pale, her hair matted with sweat. "It's not a boy," she cried, clutching his arm. "It's not a boy." Before Filipovich could answer, her eyes rolled back and she collapsed, convulsing violently. Dark veins spidered across her neck, spreading like ink in water. Something unseen dragged her body backward into the darkness, leaving deep scratches along the tile floor. Oh. The humming reached a new crescendo. Lights exploded overhead, showering glass on the doctors and staff. The boy stopped in the center of the main hallway. His eyes glowed faintly now, reflecting the flickering light. He raised one small hand, and the chaos around him froze. Patients halted mid-step. Nurses stopped screaming. Even the whispers went silent. Then, in a voice too deep for his small frame, he said one word: "Open." Every locked door in Blackwood Asylum swung wide, and the building exhaled like a living creature finally freed from its restraints. The sound of the doors unlocking was deafening, an endless metallic clatter echoing through the halls like 1,000 chains snapping at once. Blackwood Asylum had become a mausoleum awakening from its long, unwilling slumber. From the cells they emerged. Some shuffled forward like sleepwalkers, their faces slack, their movements jerky as though someone else was piloting their bodies. Others crawled out on all fours, spines arched, whispering in perfect synchrony with voices that were not their own. Their mouths moved, but their words didn't belong to them. They were older, heavier, echoing with a cadence that made the air itself vibrate. One man, his face stitched with old surgical scars, stepped into the flickering hallway light. The shadows clung to him unnaturally, crawling up his body like tendrils. His head jerked unnaturally to the side, bones cracking audibly. In a deep, guttural voice that could not possibly have come from his throat, he whispered, "We remember." Others followed, each more grotesque than the last. A woman with milky white eyes dragged herself forward, her jaw distended, teeth clicking against the floor as she moved. Behind her, a boy no older than 10 shuffled with his arms hanging loosely, wrists broken and dangling, yet his mouth was stretched in an impossible grin. The whispers grew into chants, the same phrase repeated over and over in a tongue no one alive should understand. Dr. Filipovich backed away, heart hammering. "This isn't real," he muttered, though his voice trembled with the knowledge that it was. He pressed his back against the cold wall, watching in horror as more doors swung open. Some cells were empty, yet still something stepped out, shapes darker than shadow, moving with purpose. The boy stood perfectly still in the middle of the chaos, his glowing eyes fixed on the ceiling as though communing with something far above, or far below. The asylum trembled, the old building groaning like a ship caught in a storm. A sudden gust of icy wind roared down the corridor, carrying with it a stench of rot and damp earth. Nurses and orderlies huddled in corners, weeping silently, their sanity already cracking under the weight of what they were witnessing. Then, one of the entities stepped forward, a towering figure draped in tattered restraints, its face obscured by a hood of flesh. It reached out with elongated fingers, touching the wall, and wherever it touched, the paint peeled away, revealing symbols carved into the very foundation of the asylum. Dr. Filipovich felt his knees weaken. This wasn't just an outbreak. This wasn't madness. This was a ritual. The boy's glowing eyes dimmed for a moment, like a candle flickering in a draught, then flared brighter than before. The light spilling from them wasn't soft or warm. It was the color of old bones and lightning-struck skies. It cast the hallway in stark, unnatural shadows that twisted and writhed as though alive. Dr. Filipovich pressed himself flat against the wall, trying to make himself small, invisible. But the boy wasn't looking at him, or anyone else in the room. His gaze was fixed upward, toward the cracked plaster ceiling, as though staring through it, through the floors above, through the night sky beyond. And then Filipovich realized something terrifying. The boy wasn't seeing through the ceiling. He was calling through it. The chant from the creatures deepened, their voices harmonizing with a pitch so low it rattled teeth. Symbols on the peeling walls began to glow faintly, pulsing like heartbeats. The temperature dropped sharply, and condensation curled off every surface. The asylum smelled of wet stone, mildew, and freshly turned soil. A fissure split across the ceiling with a loud crack, dust raining down like ash. The boy raised one thin, trembling hand, his fingers twitching in sharp, deliberate motions as though plucking invisible strings. With each gesture, the fissure spread, and more creatures emerged from the darkness of the cells, their forms half human, half forgotten. One of the nurses broke. She bolted for the end of the hall, her shoes slapping against the tile. She didn't make it 3 steps before something invisible yanked her backward. Her scream cut off abruptly as her body snapped, folding in ways a body was never meant to bend. The orderlies who saw it sank to the floor, sobbing. The boy's lips moved. No sound came out at first. Then a voice, not a child's voice, but a chorus of hundreds, spoke through him. The ground remembers, the stones remember, the dead remember. The fissure in the ceiling widened, and through it came a faint but unmistakable sound. A chorus of screams, distant yet deafening, like the echo of every soul who had ever perished within Blackwood's walls. The asylum itself seemed to breathe, its ancient timbers groaning under the weight of something immense pressing down from above. Filipovich's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. "This isn't a summoning," he whispered, though his words were swallowed by the chant. "This is a door." And the boy was the key. The hallway groaned like the hull of a sinking ship, and the fissure above widened into a jagged, yawning crack. From within, no light spilled, only a thick, black mist that seeped downward in slow, writhing tendrils, clinging to the walls like living tar. The mist was cold enough to sting, frosting the tiles beneath it as it pooled around their feet. Dr. Filipovich stumbled backward, his hands clutching the wall for balance. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his mind screamed for silence. Don't let it hear you. Whatever was coming through that fissure wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It wasn't meant for this world. The boy's body convulsed violently, his thin limbs jerking as though pulled by unseen marionette strings. His glowing eyes rolled back, leaving only milky whites, yet his mouth never stopped moving. The chorus that issued from his lips grew deeper, louder, vibrating in the marrow of every soul in that corridor. "It has waited beneath your stones, beneath your prayers, beneath your sins." A shadow, no, a shape, moved inside the mist above, vast and indistinct, its outline pressing against reality like a hand against thin cloth. The crack in the ceiling wasn't a doorway anymore, it was a wound, and the thing pressing through was forcing that wound wider. One of the orderlies dropped to his knees, sobbing, clutching a crucifix to his chest. He screamed a prayer into the icy air, but his words were drowned by a sound from the fissure, a single deafening heartbeat. The walls trembled with it, the glass light fixtures rattling violently until they shattered, showering shards onto the terrified staff. Filipovich grabbed the arm of a nurse frozen in place and yanked her toward a side hall. "We have to get out," he hissed, though his voice cracked under the weight of terror. The boy's head snapped toward them, his glowing eyes locking onto Filipovich with unnatural precision. He didn't blink, he didn't breathe. His lips curled into the faintest smile, and his voice dropped to a whisper so soft yet so clear it might have been spoken directly into the doctor's skull. "There is no out." From above, a skeletal, elongated hand, impossibly large and wrapped in rotting, tar-soaked flesh, slipped through the crack, its nails scraping against the ceiling beams, showering splinters below. The asylum itself seemed to moan as if in pain, its structure bending and shifting under the weight of what was coming. Dr. Filipovich knew then that this wasn't just a haunting, it was a birth. The ceiling gave a sickening groan as the crack tore wider, chunks of plaster raining down like hail. The mist that poured from the fissure thickened, choking the corridor, filling every breath with the taste of wet earth and rot. The air was heavy, too heavy, like standing beneath a storm about to break, the pressure pressing against skulls and lungs until every inhale felt like drowning. Filipovich stumbled backward, clutching the wall for support, his eyes darting toward the emergency exit at the far end of the hall. The green sign above the door flickered weakly, as if the building itself knew escape was no longer an option. Nurses screamed and orderlies scrambled, their frantic shouts swallowed by the deep rhythmic sound reverberating from above. Thump, thump, thump. It was a heartbeat, but too slow, too powerful, as though it didn't belong to any creature that should walk this earth. The boy's frail body arched violently, his spine bowing to an unnatural angle, his jaw unhinged with a wet crack, his mouth stretching wide enough to tear the corners of his lips. The voice that came out of him was no longer a whisper, it was a roar, low, guttural, and layered with hundreds of voices that spoke in perfect unison. "We will come through him." From the ceiling, another hand emerged, this one skeletal but thicker, dripping with that same tar-like rot. It gripped the edge of the fissure, pulling apart the stone and wood as though it were paper. Screams echoed through the hall as the walls themselves bent inward, pipes groaning and bursting under invisible pressure. Filipovich grabbed the nearest nurse, dragging her toward the emergency door. "Move," he shouted, though his own voice was breaking. They ran, their footsteps echoing on the trembling tiles, but the sound was drowned out by something else, something crawling through the crack. A face pressed against the opening. Not human, not animal. Its features were indistinct, shifting as though reality itself couldn't decide what it was. Empty sockets stared down at them, and from its mouth, or what could loosely be called one, dripped long strings of black ichor that hissed when they struck the floor. The boy's glowing eyes followed Filipovich's every movement. His twisted body began to float inches off the bed, the restraints hanging loose like shredded paper. "Do you think your walls can hold us?" he said, but this time his voice was different, higher, mocking, like a child imitating a priest. Filipovich shoved the emergency bar on the door. It didn't move. It didn't even rattle. And then slowly, the green exit sign flickered once, twice, and went black. The hallway plunged into darkness, not the kind that settles when the lights go out, but a suffocating blackness so absolute it felt alive, like tar filling every inch of space. Nurses clutched one another, their sobs muffled, as if sound itself had been swallowed. Then came the scraping, metal against stone, bone against wood. The fissure in the ceiling widened with a deafening crack, and something impossibly large slid through. Its limbs were too long, bending at angles that defied anatomy. Its head, or what resembled one, turned slowly, eyeless sockets glowing faintly with a pale corpse-like light. The air stank of sulfur and blood. Dr. Filipovich pressed his back to the door, one arm shielding the trembling nurse behind him. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs were rooted to the floor. The creature's body unfurled like smoke and shadow, slipping down the wall in a slow, deliberate crawl. Its fingers, razor-thin and jointed like spider legs, dragged along the tiles, leaving black scorch marks wherever they touched. The boy hung in midair, suspended by an unseen force. His tiny chest rose and fell, but his eyes burned brighter, illuminating the beast in flickering flashes. The creature's face stretched into something resembling a grin, though no flesh moved. "He is the door." The voices boomed from every corner of the hospital. "You built your walls too thin." Panic exploded. An orderly bolted toward the stairwell, but the creature turned its head, just a tilt, slow and predatory, and the man's body went rigid. His scream was silent as his spine bent backward with a sound like snapping branches. His lifeless corpse floated for a moment before being yanked upward into the fissure, vanishing as if swallowed whole. The nurse behind Filipovich shrieked and clung to him, sobbing, "Please, father, do something." He had no answer. His prayers died in his throat, useless against whatever stood before them. The boy's body convulsed again, and from his mouth poured a stream of black liquid splattering on the tiles. Where it landed, the floor cracked, and tiny skeletal hands began clawing their way out, dragging themselves free. The hallway became a nightmare of writhing limbs and shadowed faces, whispering and laughing in a language older than humanity. And through it all, the boy's expression was eerily calm. "We are many." The screams began to multiply, echoing through every corridor of the hospital like a choir of the damned. Somewhere above, a crash shook the building, followed by the distinct sound of shattering glass. The emergency alarms wailed, but their shrill cry was quickly drowned by something worse. Whispers, thousands of them, slithering through the air like a swarm of locusts. Filipovich grabbed the nurse's hand and pulled her back toward a supply closet, but the door they had come through was gone. In its place was a wall, solid plaster, cracked and breathing as if it were alive. He turned in a panic. Every hallway stretched impossibly long, twisting in angles that should not exist. The hospital had become a maze, its architecture folding in on itself like an origami nightmare. "Father, what's happening?" the nurse sobbed. Before he could answer, a gurney flew past them, levitating for a brief moment before slamming into the ceiling. The body strapped to it, an unconscious patient, awoke mid-flight, thrashing violently as their bones snapped in unnatural rhythm. The gurney burst apart on impact, and the patient's mangled body crawled backward along the ceiling like a spider. The boy's cries echoed from every direction, even though he still floated motionless at the heart of the chaos. His voice was layered, no longer that of an infant, but of countless throats, speaking at once. "We are awake. You should not have called us." The skeletal hands that had clawed their way out of the black puddles now dragged full bodies with them. Figures of pure shadow, humanoid in shape but with faces obscured by writhing darkness, began to pull themselves free. Their fingers were long and sharpened, their movements deliberate, as if savoring the fear around them. Filipovich clutched the crucifix around his neck and whispered a prayer, his voice trembling. One of the creatures tilted its head and let out a distorted laugh that sounded like the twisting of metal. Then the lights came back on, but the brightness brought no comfort. Every person in the hallway, nurses, doctors, orderlies, was standing perfectly still. Their eyes were black voids, their heads tilted at the same unnatural angle. As one, they began to speak in unison, their voices vibrating through the floor. "He will not die because death is beneath him." The boy's small body descended slowly to the floor. He opened his mouth again, but this time he spoke clearly, just one word. "Run," and the entire building obeyed. The word "run" was not a suggestion, it was a command. The hospital convulsed like a living beast, its very foundations groaning in pain. Ceiling tiles rained down in a storm of dust, and the fluorescent lights exploded one by one, plunging the corridors into a strobe of flickering hell. The once sterile smell of antiseptic was now replaced with the copper stench of blood, and something older, something like damp soil from a graveyard. Filipovich pulled the nurse forward, his hand trembling but firm. Every step was a battle. The floor itself seemed to shift, rippling beneath their feet as if the building was breathing. The hallway stretched impossibly, each doorway elongating into shadowy voids. Inside those doorways, shapes stirred, faces that weren't human, eyes that glowed faintly like dying embers. A guttural roar reverberated through the entire structure. Somewhere deep below, something massive was awake, dragging itself upward. "Don't look back," Filipovich whispered, but the nurse couldn't help herself. She turned. What she saw nearly broke her. The staff who had stood motionless moments ago were now in motion, but not walking. They were twitching forward in violent spasms, bones snapping with every jerky step, heads rolling loosely on shattered necks. Black ichor leaked from their mouths and eye sockets, and their voices carried that same bone-deep resonance. "He breathes where breath has no meaning. He reigns where death has no throne." Doors slammed shut on their own. Windows shattered inward. The walls themselves began to close in, as if the entire hospital wanted to swallow them. The boy's cries rang out again, a single wail that made blood drip from the ears of those still alive. Filipovich and the nurse stumbled into a stairwell, only to find that the stairs didn't lead down anymore. Instead, the stairwell spiraled infinitely upward, lined with doors at impossible angles. Every door creaked open, revealing glimpses of other places, a dark forest swaying without wind, an abandoned cathedral filled with candles burning upside down, a mirror maze where their reflections moved independently. Something crawled out of one of the doors, a figure that might have been human once, its spine bent backward, its fingers dragging like hooks. The priest swung his crucifix forward, shouting prayers in Latin, his voice breaking. The creature paused, then smiled. The lights died completely. In the pitch black, hundreds of whispers spoke at once, You prayed to us, and now we answer. The whispers didn't fade. They thickened, filling every crevice of the hospital like smoke. They weren't coming from one place. They were everywhere. In the walls, in the vents, in the very air they breathed. The priest tightened his grip on the crucifix, but it felt heavier now, like it was being pulled downward by unseen hands. The nurse sobbed quietly, clutching her stomach as if trying to hold herself together. They stumbled forward, following a faint glow down one of the endless corridors. It wasn't light. It was something worse, a pulsing radiance that bled from the cracks in the hospital floor like veins glowing beneath flesh. The glow led them to a door that shouldn't have been there. It was enormous, made of ancient wood, carved with spirals and symbols that hurt to look at. The boys' cries were louder here, sharper, like nails scraping across their skulls. But it wasn't just crying now. There was laughter underneath. The priest pressed his palm to the door and immediately jerked back. The wood was warm, almost feverish. A heartbeat thudded within it. "Father," the nurse whispered, "this building is alive." The words made him freeze. She was right. The floor trembled with every beat. The walls exhaled softly, releasing warm, rancid air. Somewhere far above, metal groaned and bones cracked, echoing like thunder. A sudden shriek tore through the corridor and the ceiling split open. Long skeletal arms shot out of the darkness, grabbing at them. The priest swung his crucifix, the metal striking one of the limbs. It didn't retreat. It screamed. The sound wasn't from its throat, but from inside their heads. "Move!" the priest shouted. They ran, slamming through the giant wooden door, only to find themselves in a cavernous operating theater. The floor was slick with blood, but it wasn't red anymore. It shimmered black, reflecting their faces in distorted ways. Dozens of surgical tables stood in neat rows, each occupied by a figure covered in white sheets. The nurse lifted a trembling hand to one of the sheets, but Filipovich grabbed her wrist. "Don't." Too late. The sheet slipped away, revealing a body. Her body. Eyes wide, mouth sewn shut, skin grey and waxy. Every table bore another version of them. The priest, the nurse, even the boy. All dead. All perfectly preserved. From the far corner of the room, a slow clapping began. A figure stepped forward, robed in black, face hidden beneath a veil of chains. Its voice was soft, almost kind. "Welcome, Father. You've been expected." The robed figure moved closer, its footsteps silent on the blood-slick floor. The chains draped over its face rattled softly, but there was no body beneath the black fabric, just shifting shadows that swallowed the light. The priest raised his crucifix, voice breaking as he recited a prayer. "Deliver us from evil, O Lord." "Do you think he hears you?" The voice slithered out from behind the chains, deep and layered, as if dozens of throats spoke at once. "Do you think he dares come here?" The crucifix bent in his hand. Metal groaned like bone under pressure, and in a blink it snapped in two. The priest staggered back, clutching the broken halves. The figure glided closer, and the shadows beneath its robe rippled, revealing glimpses of eyes, hundreds of them, rolling in and out of existence. Some blinked, some bled, some wept black tears. "This place is mine," it whispered, "and so is he." The nurse was trembling violently now, her eyes wide with terror. Who is he?" she choked out. The figure tilted its head, and the chains swung, chiming like distant funeral bells. "The boy? He is not yours to save. He was never yours." It raised a hand, or something like a hand. Long skeletal fingers tipped with nails like black glass unfurled, reaching toward the air. In an instant, the walls of the operating theater peeled away, dissolving like wet paper, revealing a void beyond. There was no hospital anymore, no walls, no floor. They stood on a narrow bridge of bone suspended over an endless chasm. Far below, countless faces writhed in a sea of darkness, their mouths open in silent screams. The priest clutched his Bible, but the words swam on the page. The nurse fell to her knees, covering her ears as whispers rose from the abyss. The robed figure stepped forward, its shadow growing impossibly tall. "He is older than you, Father, older than your church, older than your God. He was born to wake me." The air trembled as the boy's laughter echoed from somewhere in the void. It was no longer a child's laugh. It was deep, ancient, a sound that made their blood run cold. The nurse screamed, and the sound shattered the bridge beneath them. They fell into darkness, and as they plummeted, the figure's whisper followed them down. "Welcome to his cradle." They didn't land. They simply stopped falling. The nurse's breath caught in her throat as she realized she was kneeling on something soft and wet, like flesh. Around them, there was no floor, no ceiling, just an endless black void pulsing faintly as though they were inside a colossal living thing. The priest staggered to his feet, clutching his Bible to his chest, his face pale and dripping with sweat. "Stay close," he whispered hoarsely, though his voice trembled. Then they heard it. A heartbeat. Slow, deep. It rattled their bones. Thum, thum, thum. From the blackness ahead, something small began to glow. At first it was the faint shape of a crib, a child's crib, rocking gently, though there was no wind. The sound of lullabies whispered through the void, sung by voices that weren't human. The priest's lips moved soundlessly in prayer, but no words came out. They approached cautiously, step by step. The glow from the crib grew stronger, revealing slick, glistening walls that pulsed like veins under skin. The air smelled of copper and rot. Then a small giggle cut through the silence. The boy. But when the nurse peered over the edge of the crib, she staggered back, gagging. It wasn't a baby. It wasn't even human. The creature lying in the crib had the shape of a child, yes, but its skin was translucent, showing rivers of black ichor pumping through veins that branched like tree roots. Its face split open down the center, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that clicked softly as it smiled. Its eyes, if they were eyes, were nothing but black voids, sucking in all light. "Isn't he beautiful?" the robed figure whispered from somewhere in the dark. The chains clinked as it stepped closer. The boy moved, or rather, his body folded and unfolded in ways that broke the rules of anatomy. Limbs stretched, bent backward, and rearranged themselves. His laughter deepened, Ned resonating like a drumbeat from the pit of hell itself. The nurse fell backward, scrambling. The priest, trembling, raised his Bible high and shouted, "In the name of God!" The boy's mouth widened unnaturally, splitting all the way back to his ears, then further, until his jaw hung open like a serpent's. His voice came out, not as words, but as a roar that shook the ground. The void lit up, just for a moment. And they saw faces, thousands of them, pressed into the pulsing walls around them, screaming, crying, praying, all watching with empty, hollow eyes. The boy sat up in his crib, his smile impossibly wide. "He doesn't hear you," he whispered in a voice like 1,000 echoes. "But I do." The robed figure knelt beside him, lowering its chained face. "And now, we begin." In the days that followed, the asylum's atmosphere shifted from mere dread to something far darker, predatory. The building itself seemed to breathe, its wooden beams creaking like ribs under strain, its windows frosting over even in summer warmth. Doctors began reporting blackouts, moments when they'd lose time. One physician claimed he awoke standing barefoot in the courtyard with blood on his hands, unable to recall how he'd gotten there. Another, a nurse with 20 years of service, quit abruptly after she walked into the boy's cell and found herself staring at her own corpse, hanging from the rafters. The boy never spoke again. He simply sat cross-legged in the corner of his cell, staring at anyone who entered with an intensity that felt surgical. Yet the drawings on the walls multiplied overnight, filling blank spaces with impossible precision. They no longer depicted apocalyptic landscapes but maps, floor plans of the asylum, routes through hidden passageways no one had ever seen, and symbols that resembled ancient alchemical markings. One evening, Dr. Filipovich gathered his remaining staff for a meeting in the main hall. His face was gaunt, his once pristine coat stained. "The boy is not a patient," he said hoarsely, voice trembling. "He is a door. We are keeping a door open." The staff erupted in panic, arguing, shouting, some weeping. The head orderly swore he'd kill the child himself, that it was the only way to end the nightmare. But even as he spoke, the gas lamps flickered, and every single door in the asylum burst open at once. The sound of metal slamming against stone echoed through the halls like a thunderclap. Patients screamed as if something unseen had brushed past them, leaving frostbite burns on their arms. When they rushed back toward E, the boy was gone. In his place, scrawled in his own hand across the entire floor, was a single word: below. The search began that very night, though no one wanted to admit how terrified they were. The asylum's staff moved in a tight group, lanterns casting long, jagged shadows across the decaying corridors. The word below echoed in their minds like a curse, guiding their steps. Dr. Filipovich led the way, holding a flickering lamp in one trembling hand and a revolver in the other. He had spent hours examining the boy's intricate wall drawings, memorizing the strange lines and symbols. The map suggested a network of tunnels beneath the asylum, passages that weren't on any of the original blueprints. They began in the basement, where the air was thick with mildew and something sharper, coppery, like blood. The stone walls sweated moisture, and their boots echoed in hollow rhythms, as if something beneath the floor was knocking back. Behind a row of rusted pipes, the doctor found it. A narrow doorway, sealed with planks so ancient they crumbled to dust at his touch. The doorframe wasn't built by human hands. It was arched in a strange, uneven curve, etched with markings that matched those in the boy's cell. No one wanted to go first. The orderly who'd sworn he'd kill the boy now stood pale and shaking, muttering prayers in Polish. A nurse clutched her rosary so tightly the beads left welts in her palm. Dr. Filipovich swallowed his fear and stepped through. The passage was tight, forcing them to crouch. The deeper they descended, the colder it became. Their breath fogged and the smell grew unbearable, a mix of wet soil, rot, and something faintly sweet, like overripe fruit. Then they heard it, a sound like whispering, but layered, as if 1,000 voices murmured at once. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, which were no longer brick or stone, but some kind of black, porous material that absorbed their lantern light. "Do you hear that?" whispered the nurse. "No one," he answered. The whispers grew louder as they reached a chamber at the tunnel's end. It was circular, with a floor of packed earth and walls covered in symbols drawn in a dark, glistening substance. In the center stood a wooden chair, its legs sunk deep into the soil, as though it had been sitting there for centuries. And there, dangling from the ceiling above the chair, was a single noose. The whispers stopped all at once. The chamber breathed. That was the first thing they noticed. The walls moved almost imperceptibly, expanding and contracting as though the entire tunnel system were some great, sleeping animal. The lanterns flickered, their flames bending in unnatural drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. Dr. Filipovich's throat tightened. He'd spent years studying anatomy, dissecting bodies, mapping blood vessels, but nothing had prepared him for this. The walls weren't just damp. They glistened, almost wet, as if alive. When he touched one with a trembling hand, it pulsed faintly beneath his fingers. The nurse let out a sharp gasp and stepped back, clutching her rosary. "This isn't right," she whispered, voice trembling. "This place wasn't built. It grew." The orderly, the same one who had sworn vengeance on the boy, fell to his knees and vomited. His lantern slipped from his hand, casting wild shadows across the chamber. For a moment, the symbols on the walls appeared to twist and writhe, rearranging themselves into something like a face with no eyes, only a gaping mouth. A low hum began to fill the air, deep and resonant. It wasn't coming from the walls or the floor, but from beneath them, like the groan of something ancient shifting in its sleep. Dust rained down from the ceiling as the hum rose to a bone-rattling vibration. The noose above the chair swayed on its own. "No one built this," Dr. Filipovich murmured to himself. "This is older than the asylum, older than Krakow." The nurse's rosary snapped in her trembling hands, beads scattered across the damp floor, rolling into cracks that seemed to swallow them. "Doctor," whispered the orderly, voice hoarse with fear, "what if the boy didn't draw this from memory? What if it told him how to find it?" As if in response, the hum stopped. The silence was worse. Their breathing and the distant drip of water echoed, unnaturally loud, like sound didn't belong here. Then came the smell. A heavy, sweet stench seeped from the soil beneath the chair, thick enough to taste. One of the nurses gagged and stumbled back, her heel striking something buried in the dirt. It wasn't a rock. It was a skull, and not just one. Dozens of them, half sunk in the soil like seeds that had been planted and left to rot. The lantern light trembled as the nurse's scream tore through the chamber, echoing back in distorted whispers that didn't sound entirely human. She stumbled away from the skull, but her heel struck another and another until she collapsed in a heap, sobbing and shaking. Dr. Filipovich dropped to one knee, brushing soil away from the nearest skull. The bone was smooth, polished by time, but there were deep gouges carved into the forehead, symbols, jagged and deliberate. His hands trembled as he traced them. "These aren't graves," he muttered. "They're messages." The orderly swallowed hard, his face pale. Messages for who? A wet sound echoed from the shadows, like lips smacking together. All three froze. The lantern light flickered violently as though trying to warn them. Something was breathing beneath their feet. "Get away from the chair," Filipovich hissed. He scrambled backward, dragging the sobbing nurse with him. The floor trembled, soil shifting as if something enormous shifted in its sleep below. The noose above the chair swayed violently, creaking like a pendulum, though there was no wind. The hum returned, louder this time, carrying with it whispers. Hundreds of voices layered over one another, speaking in a language none of them knew. The walls pulsed in rhythm with the sound, veins of black spreading like cracks across the glistening surface. The nurse's rosary beads glimmered faintly where they'd fallen, but one by one they vanished into the cracks in the floor, pulled down like prey sinking into a predator's mouth. Filipovich's breath caught. "It's feeding," he whispered. "This place, it's alive." A fissure opened beneath the chair, soil crumbling away to reveal something pale and slick beneath. For an instant, the lantern's glow caught what lay there. Not stone, not bone, but flesh. Flesh as vast as the earth itself, rippling with unseen movement. "Duh!" The orderly gagged, bile rising in his throat. We have to leave. Now." But the tunnel behind them seemed to have narrowed, the exit shrinking into shadow. The air grew heavy, thick as if they were standing underwater. Every breath burned their lungs with a sweet, rotten stench. And then, from deep beneath the chair, came a sound they would never forget. A heartbeat, slow, tremendous, ancient. Filipovich's lantern flickered out. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating black that pressed against their eyes like cloth. The heartbeat was no longer faint. It was everywhere. It throbbed through the soil, through the chair, through their own bones, rattling teeth in their jaws. Each pulse carried a vibration, and each vibration carried a voice. "Leave." The word was not spoken. It was breathed into their skulls, filling every thought, echoing through marrow. The nurse screamed, clutching her head, nails digging deep into her scalp until blood streamed between her fingers. Filipovich fumbled with the lantern, his trembling hands striking matches that instantly extinguished in the heavy, wet air. The orderly backed against the slick-veined wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The fissure beneath the chair widened, and something began to rise. At first, it looked like bone, gleaming pale in the dim glow of their dying lantern light, but as it ascended, they saw that it wasn't bone at all. It was an eye, a single, lidless, human-sized eye. Veins as thick as tree roots pulsed around it, glowing faintly like embers buried under ash. The pupil was not round, but a perfect unnatural square, and it turned slowly, deliberately, to fix on Filipovich. The doctor's mind split like glass. He dropped the lantern, it shattered, oil spilling across the floor, flames licking the soil. For a moment the chamber lit up in an infernal glow, and they saw it clearly. A face beneath the earth, enormous and ancient, stitched together from hundreds of human faces, their mouths sewn shut, their eyes wide and weeping. The entire underground chamber was its skull, its body buried deep below. The heartbeat quickened. "You, dig." The voices were layered, male and female, child and elder, some shrieking, some whispering prayers. The words slammed into their minds, making their noses bleed. The nurse scrambled to hers, our feet, and bolted toward the tunnel. But the earth shifted. Black roots burst through the soil, slick and pulsating, wrapping around her ankles like serpents. She shrieked, clawing at the ground, but the roots dragged her toward the chair. The noose above swayed as if anticipating her. The orderly grabbed her arms, pulling desperately, but another tendril shot out, impaling his shoulder and dragging him back. He screamed as he was lifted from the ground, blood streaming down his shirt. Filipovich froze. His body wouldn't obey him. He was staring into that square pupil, and he knew in some deep animal part of his mind that it wasn't merely looking at him, it was inside him, rifling through every memory, every sin, every thought. "We remember you." Filipovich staggered backward, his boots sinking into the damp, shifting soil. The words echoed inside his skull like a hymn sung in reverse. "We remember you." His breath came shallow, ragged. No, he whispered, though the sound barely escaped his throat. You can't." The massive square pupil dilated, swallowing all light. In its black depths, he saw something impossible, a reflection of himself, but not as he was. He was younger, standing over a woman on an operating table. Her face was familiar. The nurse's? No, his wife. She was screaming, her voice raw, yet her mouth had been sewn shut. Then another image. Filipovich in a room lined with shelves of jars, each one containing fragments of human tissue. The smell of antiseptic and rot filled his nose as though the memory was real. He saw himself writing in a journal, his handwriting frantic, manic, repeating the same words over and over. "It speaks, it speaks, it speaks." "Stop," he gasped, clutching his temples. "Stop showing me this." But the visions didn't stop. They came faster. He saw children, pale, hairless, their eyes sewn shut, lying on metal tables while he held a scalpel over them. He saw the soil outside his cabin turning black, thick with something that wasn't water. And finally, he saw himself, much older, kneeling in this same chamber, whispering prayers to the face beneath the earth. "You," he breathed. "I've been here before." The heartbeat thundered, shaking dirt from the ceiling. The stitched mouths of the countless faces beneath the soil trembled, some stretching open slightly, as though they wanted to scream. "We never left," the voices said, a chorus of agony and rage. "You called, and we came." Filipovich stumbled forward, hands outstretched, as though drawn to the eye. His knees hit the dirt, and the roots slithered toward him, coiling around his wrists. They weren't pulling him down. They were holding him in place, like a congregation restraining a priest before the altar. The nurse was sobbing, her body halfway inside the fissure now, her arms clawing at the ground as the roots dragged her deeper. The orderly was pinned against the wall, impaled by black tendrils that pulsed like veins, his screams fading as blood pooled at his feet. Filipovich opened his mouth to scream, but the voice inside his head spoke again. Calm now, almost tender. "You are our hands." In that moment, he understood. He hadn't found this place tonight. He had returned to it, and all these years of digging, of hearing voices, of feeling that heartbeat, had been preparation. He was not a witness to this horror. He was its servant. The farmer's land was no longer land. It was a wound that bled whispers. The hole he had dug, once shallow, meant only for fence posts, had become a gaping black mouth. Each night, it seemed wider, as though the soil itself was pulling apart to breathe. The smell of iron and rot poured out, coating the night air with something so heavy that neighbors began to avoid the road near his farm. Those who passed swore they heard voices chanting his name in tones too deep to belong to human throats. The farmer hadn't slept in days. His hands shook from exhaustion, his nails black from clawing at his own fields, trying to cover the hole with dirt. But every morning, the soil he poured in was gone, swallowed. He'd wake to find it clean, as if he'd never touched it. The whispers were louder now, no longer distant murmurs, but voices close enough to feel their breath against his ears. They weren't pleading anymore. They were laughing. The livestock had fled. Chickens smashed themselves against their coops. The cows refused to eat. Even the old farm dog howled at nothing and ran into the woods, never to return. Alone in his house, the farmer sat by a single oil lamp, its flicker revealing shadows on the walls that moved on their own. His own reflection had vanished from mirrors. When he passed them, he saw only the open mouth of the hole, its darkness spilling into his home. He considered leaving, abandoning everything, but he knew it wouldn't matter. The voices followed him, even in his thoughts. His own mind was no longer his. It had become a tunnel, echoing their laughter. That night, as he stood at the window staring out into the fields, he saw movement, hands, dozens of them, pale and thin, clawing their way out of the ground. They weren't digging up, they were digging toward him. The farmer grabbed his lantern and a shovel, stepping out into the night. The wind carried a strand. Its heat, and the moon seemed wrong. Too close, too red. The voices roared like a storm. He stumbled to the hole and peered down, heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. Below him was no longer soil, it was a void, a pit of churning blackness, and deep inside something moved, something that had been waiting for him all along. The lantern flickered once, then died. Darkness swallowed him whole, but the voices didn't stop. They rose, chanting in a language that scraped against his skull like claws on stone. The farmer dropped to his knees at the edge of the pit, gripping the shovel like a lifeline, but he already knew it was useless. The ground trembled beneath him, pulsing like a heartbeat. His heartbeat. The hole was no longer just a hole, it was alive. It breathed. Each inhale pulled the wind toward it. Each exhale coated his face with a heat that reeked of sulfur and decay. The farmer's breath came in ragged gasps as he crawled closer, unable to resist the pull. His body wasn't his anymore. His hands trembled as though guided by something unseen, lowering the shovel into the pit. The metal clanged against something solid. Not stone, not wood, but bone. The earth beneath him shuddered, and he heard a sound no man should ever hear. Laughter. Thousands of voices, all laughing at once. The ground split beneath his knees. His body slid forward, fingers clawing at the dirt as the hole widened like a monstrous mouth. Shadows spilled out, swirling around him like smoke, and faces formed in the blackness, faces of people he'd never seen, all screaming in silence. He screamed back, but his voice was devoured. The land he'd worked his whole life betrayed him, dragging him into the void he had uncovered. And then, silence. Morning came. The farm stood still, eerily neat, as if no one had lived there for years. The livestock pens were empty. The house was quiet. The hole was gone. In its place was a perfect stretch of grass, fresh and untouched. But those who passed by the road swore they could hear something if they stopped and listened long enough. A faint scratching beneath their feet, like nails clawing at a coffin lid. Some said the farmer had fallen in. Others whispered he had been taken. The land was never sold, never farmed again. Children dared each other to walk across it, but none stayed long. The air was always too heavy there, the silence too deep, and at night, when the wind carried just right, the voices could still be heard, laughing softly, as if something below was waiting for someone else to dig.